Lions, often regarded as the kings of the animal kingdom, possess their own unique set of qualities that make them formidable and dangerous in their own right. Their powerful builds, exceptional teamwork within prides, and lightning-fast sprints contribute to their reputation as apex predators. They are feared by millions of people around the world and wouldn't hesitate to attack and to eat us alive. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. These are the most terrifying lion attacks on humans covered on the channel so far. Welcome to Final Affliction. Catherine Chappell worked as a special effects editor in the movie industry. Her long list of accolades includes Game of Thrones, Captain America, Divergent, and Godzilla. But she also had a passion outside of the movie business. This was wildlife and the conservation of it. She was determined to help wildlife experts in the great South African bush. A few months prior to her visit to South Africa, she set up a GoFundMe page to raise money for conservation group Wildlife ACT. She reported on her social media that she would be helping with tracking and monitoring animals, participating in poaching prevention techniques, supporting veterinarians, and helping to relocate game. It was to be the adventure of a lifetime. She ventured to South Africa in June 2015 during a break in her work. Volunteering in one of the game reserves was her main interest, but she also hoped to make a film about animal poaching one day. So, this was also a form of research for her future project. She flew from Canada via London to Johannesburg. She stayed in a guest house in the city's suburb of Melville. During her visit to South Africa and following her conservation work, Catherine also organized to visit Lion Park in Gauteng, Johannesburg. She had enjoyed Joburg so far, posting photos of herself drinking refreshing cocktails and commenting on how cheap the food was in the city. For her visit around Lion Park, she chose to be shown around by tour operator Calabash Tours. Her guide for the day was Pierre Poacher, the owner of the tour company. He was a 66-year-old guide, born and bred in South Africa. The park consisted of a 20-acre enclosure, which is reported to house 85 lions. It has been visited by famous people in the past, including singers John Legend and Shakira. It offers an up-close and personal experience with one of South Africa's top predators. As cars enter the park, there are numerous warning signs telling people to remain in their vehicles, to keep their doors locked and windows closed. But people don't always follow the rules, and this is what happens when they don't. Although Catherine may have been a genius behind the camera and on the special effects computer, she didn't show any signs of genius when she entered Joburg's Lion Park. Passing through the tall metal gates and into the lion enclosure, almost immediately, Catherine could see the resident lions. Most were lying on the grass, sunning themselves in the sunshine. They looked docile and tame, but these lions were anything but. They may not have had the freedom to roam in the likes of South Africa's enormous expanse of Kruger National Park, but they were by no means tame. You can take the animal out of the wild, but you cannot take the wild out of the animal. A male and female lion lay peacefully on the verge. Pierre pulled up alongside them. Catherine had her camera at the ready. As soon as he stopped the 4x4, she began snapping away. They were just feet from the animals. Zooming in through her camera lens, Catherine could see the tiniest of details: the fine fur on their muzzles, the deep brown eyes, and white canine teeth as they panted in the afternoon sun. Instinctively, Catherine wound down the window to get a clearer shot. As she did so, the lions' faces came into sharp focus. She marveled at their beauty, their graceful presence, and calm demeanor, but that demeanor was about to change. The female lion stood up. She stretched, her backside into the air, her huge front paws flexing on the soft ground. She yawned, her upper lip revealing her teeth. Then she turned towards Catherine. All the while, Catherine continued to snap her photographs. They were the perfect shots. The park was full of tourists. A line of cars lined the road behind Catherine and Pierre's car, each waiting for their chance to look at the lions. just feet from their cars. But the cars immediately behind Pierre's had spotted Catherine's window open and her black camera lens poking out. They could see the lioness approaching the vehicle while the young woman did nothing. Perhaps she couldn't see it. Perhaps she was too focused on the male lion at the time. With one eye closed and the other honed in on the male's spectacular mane, maybe Catherine was oblivious to the imminent danger she was in. The other drivers began to honk their horns, concerned for the woman's safety. The honking of the horns did nothing to alert Catherine or Pierre. It did nothing to deter the approaching lioness. Instead, the female leapt up to the SUV, her front paws locking onto the side of the metal, the full weight of her body pushing against the vehicle. Catherine jumped backwards, but there was nowhere for her to go. She fumbled with her seatbelt. She hadn't expected the lion to jump up like that. Now she was face to face with the predator. She could smell its breath. She looked directly into its eyes. The lion was nearly as tall as the 4x4 when she stood on her hind legs. An incredibly powerful beast with thousands of years of killing instinct packed into an incredibly muscular body. Catherine couldn't close the window. That would mean leaning towards the lion. It would mean pushing its head back out of the window so that she could reach the button. Catherine's heart thundered in her chest. She felt her adrenaline pulsating through her body, wondering what to do. But even in those first few seconds, she didn't believe the animal would attack. The relaxed nature of the park, the docile-looking lions, led her into a false sense of security. The lioness's head almost filled the whole window. It was so much bigger close up than Catherine could ever have imagined. It paused in the window for a few seconds. It was assessing the situation, making sense of the people inside the car. Then, a split second later, the lioness lunged at Catherine. The 29-year-old screamed as she felt the lion clamp its jaws down around her shoulder and neck, the sharp canines torn into her flesh, severing blood vessels. Pierre leaned across Catherine. He tried desperately to hit the lioness, to push her away, but she was too strong. She was too powerful. The lioness ripped apart Catherine's shoulder and neck and then jumped down from the vehicle. The car immediately behind could see fresh blood dripping from its mouth, its muzzle wet with red. The male lion stood up, but the other lions nearby didn't flinch. They didn't move. They had just watched on as the female had made her attack. It was over with after a few seconds. But to their horror, the attack didn't end there. The female decided to pounce once more. This time she dived straight at the window, her head pressed into the car. She grabbed Catherine once more and tore at her face before retreating once again. In less than a minute, the lioness had caused catastrophic injuries to the young American girl. Pierre called for help on his phone and tried to stem the bleeding. He felt his legs grow weak. He felt an overwhelming pressure building in his chest, a sense of impending doom. But he fought through the agonizing sensation now gripping his chest. He applied pressure to Catherine's neck. A ranger drove at the lioness, chasing her away with his Land Rover. More staff arrived at the scene as Catherine was pulled out of the vehicle and laid on the ground. One of the staff members froze. Pierre shouted at them to help him administer first aid, but the worker was in an apparent state of shock. They hesitated, reluctant to get involved, costing Catherine precious seconds that she didn't have. After what felt like an eternity for Pierre, an ambulance finally arrived, but it was too late. Paramedics tried to revive Catherine, but she had lost too much blood. There was nothing they could do. Described by her sister as fearless, it seems Catherine had a great appetite for adventure and was enthusiastic to try new things. Her boyfriend broke down at her memorial service, speaking of their final conversation together, in which he warned her to be careful and for her to remember that she's a city girl. Pierre was heartbroken. In fact, doctors at the hospital, after patching up his severely bitten arm, confirmed he had suffered from a heart attack at the time of the lion attack. The overwhelming pain in his chest had been his heart, but he had bravely fought through it to try to protect his client. Of course, following the incident, questions were asked of Pierre and his company, Calabash Tours. Some eyewitnesses said that they had seen the driver's side window open as the car drove around the park. Catherine was then merely following his example. Yet another thing she witnessed that lulled her into a false sense of security. But Pierre strongly denies this. He knew the rules. He knew it was dangerous to drive through lion territory with car windows open. The Lion Park refused to close the park following the incident, and the lion was not put down for her actions. Rangers said at the time she was in estrus and ready to mate. This may have led to her being particularly defensive and wary of encroaching visitors. Remarkably, despite the desperately sad news of Catherine's death traveling fast, the very next day, visitors to the park continued to drive through the enclosure with their windows wound down. It seems some people just won't learn from the mistakes of others. It is only a matter of time before someone else meets their tragic final affliction.
John Henry Patterson arrived in Mombasa, British East Africa on March 1, 1898. He was greeted by the magnificent fortress Fort Jesus, built to protect the city's residents. After all, Mombasa connected the rivers to the Indian Ocean, allowing anyone controlling the vital port to have influence and power over maritime trade. Unsurprisingly, the beautiful port had a bloody history. It was captured and recaptured by the Portuguese and the sultans throughout the 1600s, changing hands at least 9 times. In 1895, the British finally bought Fort Jesus and were keen on keeping it that way. They decided to build a 1,000-kilometer railway across the land, starting at Mombasa all the way to Busha in 1896. This was the reason Patterson, a lieutenant colonel in the British Army known for his fearlessness and competence, was sent there. He was commissioned by the London-based Uganda Railway Committee to ensure the British investment was going as planned. After spending nearly a week in Mombasa, the anxious Patterson finally received marching orders in the form of a letter instructing him to oversee the construction of a bridge over the Tsavo River. Ideally, he would see its completion before the railway was completed from the opposite end. Patterson rode the train out of Mombasa and was immediately love-struck by the lush vegetation surrounding the area. However, upon entering the Taru Desert, the environment drastically shifted into something desolate, dead even. Perhaps it was a foreshadowing of the darkness to come. Patterson arrived at Tsavo by sunset the following day. From a distance, he could see the 8,000 Indian laborers encamped 7 miles out from the unfinished railway's end. Within the same evening, the first attacks happened. When Patterson first heard about the reports of a lion attack, he completely dismissed it. After all, the railroad workers were paid handsomely, and many had years' worth of Indian rupees in their possession. Consequently, Patterson suspected the missing worker was murdered by his fellows and subsequently thrown into the wilderness since there was no corpse. However, this all changed after a terrifying incident. One of the first few people Patterson met in Tsavo was an officer named Singh, an Indian warrior contracted to protect the railroad workers from various threats. One morning, a frantic man woke Patterson up from his tent, telling him that an enormous lion had mauled and seized Singh. Immediately, Patterson grabbed his rifle and ran to where this supposedly happened. Although the lion was not there any longer, all of Patterson's suspicions were instantly dispelled. The lion's paw prints lay visible in the sand, and Patterson noted that they were still fresh. Meanwhile, Singh's heels painted desperate furrows into the sand, mapping the direction towards absolute darkness where he was taken. Patterson asked one of the workmen who witnessed everything. According to the man, as he slept beside Singh inside the tent, the beast reared its devilish head into the door. The lion looked at the man, paralyzing him with fear, and then decided to maul the unfortunate warrior by the throat. Though Singh desperately cried out, he was no match for the powerful jaws of the frenzied creature. The man inside the tent could do nothing else but listen to Singh's whimpers from outside. Patterson decided to track the creature, and he was met with a gruesome spectacle not long after. The blood-soaked ground revealed Singh's body, or more precisely, what was left of it. Pieces of flesh lay on the ground along with the larger bones the lion couldn't have eaten. Singh's head had holes punctured by the lion's vicious teeth. His eyes were wide open the entire time. Upon closer inspection, Patterson realized there must have been 2 lions, since the tear marks on the body indicated a tug-of-war. Patterson collected the remains and buried them underneath some stones. However, he took the head back to camp for identification for the medical officer. Afterward, Patterson traced the lions further along the river. However, the tracks eventually disappeared when the soft sand met hard, rocky ground. Gazing in the distance, Patterson vowed to eliminate the beasts. Patterson's first attempt at hunting the lions happened that same evening. He sat in a tree close to Singh's tent, hoping the lions somehow acquired a taste for humans and decided to return for more victims. Some terrified workers followed and pleaded to sit with him. However, the rest remained in their closed tents. Shortly after, a series of sinister roars alarmed Patterson. The lions were back on the hunt. Being an experienced tiger hunter, Patterson knew it was a waiting game. He sat for 2 hours in total silence, hoping to finally bag the beasts. However, screams from another camp half a mile away filled the evening air. The lions had seized another victim. A poor bloke was dragged from his tent and mauled to death. Soon, Patterson attempted again to thwart the attacks by positioning himself up a tree near the latest victim's tent. However, screams from another area filled him with bitter disappointment. The sneaky devils had eluded Patterson once again and took another worker somewhere else. This turned into a game of cat and mouse where the lions were always one step ahead of Patterson. He attempted to find them during the day, but stalking 2 lions in the thick jungle of Tsavo was a fool's game, as the beasts had every advantage over the hunter. However, Patterson did not give up. He crawled, stalked, and carefully searched for the 2 beasts in the hopes of coming upon their lair. Unfortunately, it was to no avail. The lions continued seizing workers from their tents. As soon as Patterson successfully traced them towards the river, the footprints would always disappear when the sand met the rocky ground. It was as if the lions knew they would lose Patterson at that exact spot. Eventually, the lions grew bolder and more determined, attacking and seizing workers behind thick fences or even around campfires. The beasts timed their attacks so well that the workers began to believe they weren't beasts at all, but the devil himself. The lions were afraid of nothing. At one point, while Patterson was sleeping, he was awoken by movement outside of his tent. He shouted, "Who's there?" But nobody answered, so he went back to sleep. To his dread, he found footprints around the tent in the morning. Recognizing his luck, Patterson moved to a sturdier hut made from palm leaves and boughs. He surrounded the area with thorn fences positioned at a substantial height. Consequently, the worker tents were also covered by thorn fences. However, the lions still found a way to jump over or break through the barrier and seize another worker at night. The killings became so regular, men were taken from their tents every few nights. In one instance, the lions were prowling again in the dark. Some terrified workers pleaded with Patterson to let them into his quarters. He willingly did, only to realize the workers left a man alone in their tent. Patterson decided to take a few men and return to fetch the poor bloke. However, upon their arrival, they discovered the man had already died from shock after being left alone at the lions' mercy. Eventually, as the attacks mounted, the workers began fleeing from Tsavo, and the construction of the bridge was halted entirely. Consequently, colonial officials began to intervene. However, they too experienced the might of these devilish creatures. Patterson attempted to eliminate the lions many times, even preparing a trap that would use the workers as bait. However, the lions escaped unscathed for some unknown reason, leading some workers to believe the creatures were indeed devils. However, Patterson's luck soon changed. Following a botched attempt when his gun misfired, Patterson propped a wooden stage some 10 feet away from a donkey's carcass, previously killed by one of the lions. At 12 feet high, Patterson waited patiently during the night. Suddenly, one of the lions began stalking Patterson instead of the dead donkey. The creature edged nearer and nearer, and eventually, Patterson could make out the lion's form. He let loose a shot, and a terrifying roar pierced through the air. Hearing the pained creature struggle, Patterson followed through with multiple shots. Finally, the growls subsided into deep sighs and halted completely. Patterson had exorcised the devil. A few weeks later, he used the same method, and although the second lion was harder to kill, Patterson managed to bring the beast down. It took him 6 shots to finish the job. The Tsavo man-eaters were no more. The construction crew returned to the site and finished the bridge on February 1899. Although the exact number of people eaten by the lions remains unknown, Patterson recounts the figure to be around 135. Patterson turned the infamous creatures into flat-skin rug mounts for 20 years before selling them to the owner of Field Museum. To this day, the lions can be observed in the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, Illinois. Although once believed to be the devils in animal form, the maneless lions will forever be remembered as vicious beasts living in the dark pages of Uganda Railway's history. And although we're the most intelligent creatures on Earth, we must remember that once we leave our protective bubble, we're still at the mercy of nature, always under the watchful eye of the apex predators that lurk within them, waiting for their moment to pounce and bring you to your final affliction.
Diana Hansen was fascinated by lions, tigers, cheetahs, and leopards. She had the privilege of getting up close and personal with them during visits to wildlife parks. Her Facebook page was littered with photos of her next to these incredible animals. Big cats were her passion. Since Diana was 3 years old, she had loved big cats. Now, just over 20 years later, she landed her dream job, working as an intern at a big cat sanctuary in California. She was learning the ropes, learning what it took to keep some of the world's most magnificent predators in captivity. Her ultimate goal was to work in a zoo one day. Securing this internship was one step closer to that goal. She had spent time with captive tigers and lions during her studies at Western Washington State University and had visited Africa to see lions in the wild. Now, she was working at Cat Haven in Dunlap, California. The reserve was run by Project Survival, a privately funded education and conservation organization. The reserve covered an area of 100 acres and was home to tigers, leopards, lynxes, and other endangered big cats. The park was used for educational purposes to advertise the importance of these species as populations of their wild counterparts dwindle. As well as day visitors to the park, they also offered outreach programs during which staff would visit schools and places of work with the big cats to educate and inspire people. 24-year-old Diana was instantly likable amongst the staff. She had an infectious enthusiasm about her work and was devoted to the big cats. She would make up songs about each of the animals she worked with. She loved being at the reserve and working with the animals so much that she requested that she could bring her parents to work to give them a tour. The staff accepted, and a few days later Diana eagerly showed her parents around the reserve. They visited the tigers and then the lion enclosure. Inside was a male African lion named Couscous. He was 4 years old and weighed 500 pounds, 220 kilograms. He was handsome and striking, a favorite amongst visitors to Cat Haven, a favorite of Diana's. Diana's father knew the dangers his daughter was facing each day she worked at the park. He knew the stories of captive animals turning on their keepers, and he had a feeling that it may someday happen to Diana. It was almost a premonition. He imagined the phone call he might receive, the devastating news waiting for him on the other end of the line. But Diana was happy. She enjoyed her work. She had been working there for 2 months. She followed the safety protocols and knew the safety procedures when working with the big cats. On the morning of March 6, 2013, Dale Anderson, the owner of the park, left with 2 other workers for an outreach program. He was taking a cheetah to show children at a local zoo. It was a standard procedure. The staff that remained at the park, including Diana, continued with their jobs. Meg Pauls, an employee at Cat Haven, worked with Diana. The two took their usual route around the park, each of them assigned to a different section. They had a golf buggy to move around the park. With them, they carried food for the animals and equipment to clean the enclosures. As Meg went one way, Diana went the other. They would then meet at the end of their route and ride back to the staff room in their golf buggies together. This particular day was different, however. Diana's boyfriend was visiting from Italy. Diana had invited him to come and spend the day with her at Cat Haven. Maybe she wanted to prove herself to him. Maybe she wanted to show him just how majestic these animals were, or how good she was at her job. Nobody knows for sure why she did what she did. That morning, Couscous had already been fed. Just after midday, Diana entered the lion enclosure. She knew that she wasn't supposed to go in alone. Usually, 2 or 3 staff members are on site when somebody enters the pens. And as for Couscous, only Dale was ever allowed into his cage. But Diana knew where the key was. She also knew how to shut the lion in the small section of his enclosure while she cleaned the larger area. The section she locked him up in was the feeding section. He had already been in there once that day. There were 4 sections to the enclosure, 1 for a person and 3 for the lion. Each was securely fastened. There had never been any incidents or malfunctions on the gates or enclosures since the park was founded in 1993. The system seemed to work well, and all staff were adequately trained before working with the animals. Diana was sweeping the floor and scooping up the manure. She was emptying it into a large wheelbarrow when her walkie-talkie crackled into life. It was Meg. The two chatted together over the radios as Diana took a break from her chores, but her back was turned to Couscous. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she'd failed to close the gate partitioning the 2 sections. She had also failed to notice Couscous watching her with intriguing eyes. He nosed the gate and reached up with his paw. To his surprise, the gate moved. He nudged it again, and the gate swung open. He was now just feet away from the enthusiastic worker, and he stepped forwards. He was excited, curious. He sniffed the air as he placed one of his huge paws into the section of the enclosure that Diana was in. Slowly, he placed one foot in front of the other. To him, this was just a game. Living a life of solitude, he wasn't used to sharing his pen with anyone. He had been raised at the park since he was 8 weeks old, just an energetic bundle of fur. But now he stood tall, an impressive mane and powerful body. He leapt at Diana, swiping her head with his paw. Diana crashed to the ground. In that instant, she was dead. The hit from the lion's paw had snapped her neck. She hadn't seen the attack coming. She hadn't felt any pain or suffering. 1 second she was talking on the radio, and the next, she was gone. Meg, on the other end of the radio, called for Diana. She thought it was suspicious for the conversation to suddenly drop, but continued working. She had finished her section of the park, and now she waited for Diana, but there was no sign of the intern or of her golf buggy. Meg drove around to the lion enclosure, where she noticed Diana's golf buggy parked beside. She immediately spotted Diana lying on the floor of the enclosure, just beside a bush. She thought she must have fainted and called out to her. There was no response. Then her heart leapt in her chest as she noticed Couscous out of his small pen. There was nothing between the enormous lion and Diana. Calmly, Meg tried to talk to Couscous. She tried to keep him away from Diana's body whilst she hurriedly called 911. Emergency services arrived on the scene. Police officers tried to lure Couscous away into another enclosure with food so that the staff could reach Diana's body, but they were unsuccessful. The lion began acting aggressively and defensive over Diana's body. It growled and made lunges towards the emergency responders. Although Diana was unresponsive, they still needed to get the lion away from her if they were to have any chance of reviving her. At that time, they didn't know she was dead. They didn't know what had happened. Less than 30 minutes after Diana entered the lion enclosure, not only was she dead, but Couscous was shot dead by the Fresno County Sheriff's Office. It was now time for the sheriff to make that call to Diana's father. The call he had long been predicting. The call he had been dreading. The family were distraught. They were heartbroken at losing Diana so young. Their only comfort was that she died doing what she loved. Her father acknowledged that she likely died instantly, possibly without even seeing the attack coming. It was not a long, drawn-out attack. She did not suffer, and that provided some comfort for them. There is very little information about why exactly Diana went inside the cage that day. Her boyfriend has never come out with any information confirming if he saw what happened, or if he was with her during the attack. Investigators concluded that the connecting door between the 2 sections of the enclosure had not been securely fastened. They walked Diana's father through the most likely scenario. It seems that she was distracted at one crucial point and failed to securely fasten the gate. It also seemed that Couscous leapt on her in a playful way, but his strength had broken her neck in an instant. There were no markings to suggest a mauling had taken place, no scratches on her body, just a broken neck. He hadn't even bitten her neck, but it had been broken, apparently, from just one swipe of his paw, a swipe that, in the wild, can be used to take down an antelope, knocking it off its feet. Although he was raised in captivity, Couscous still had the raw power of any lion, a deadly raw power that led to Diana Hanson's unfortunate final affliction.
Mfuwe is a small village in the eastern province of Zambia. Known as a gateway to South Luangwa National Park today, Mfuwe is a popular tourist hotspot and wildlife conservation area. Its most notable attractions include safari tours, camping sites, and lodges where patrons can get up close and personal with elephants. However, our story takes place in the 90s when Mfuwe was not as tourist-friendly as it is today. In the hot summer of 1991, two boys were playing in the plains after sundown. They were supposed to have been back in the village before the big orange sun sank on the horizon, but they were enjoying their game so much that they lost track of time. As the sun set, there was no point in playing in the darkness, so they began their long walk home, hoping their parents would understand and excuse their tardiness. As they walked, they talked about their adventures that day and made plans to hang out again soon. Little did they know that they were being stalked by a deadly predator who was hiding in the tall savanna grass, waiting patiently for the right time to strike. As the boys got to a point where the road split into two, a great lion suddenly sprung out and knocked one of the boys to the ground before they even had a chance to blink. The lion wasted no time in biting the boy's neck and almost immediately rendering him quiet and subdued. The boy was dead in just a few short seconds. Shocked and panicked at the sight of seeing his friend murdered, the second boy ran for help. He stumbled through the dark, moving as fast as his legs would take him, and after breathlessly running for quite a distance, he found some game rangers who helped him call the authorities. The game rangers rushed to the attack scene, firearms drawn, but it was too late. The lion was gone, and all that remained of the dead boy were tattered bits of his clothing, parts of his chewed-up skull, and fragments of bone. That young boy was the man-eater's first victim and the beginning of its reign of terror. About 30 days after the boy's life had been gruesomely cut short, a woman was walking around the outskirts of the village gathering supplies for dinner. She needed some herbs and firewood, and it wasn't uncommon for her to get these things at the edge of the village. When she had finished, she walked back home, set her items down, and began her usual evening routine. The woman did not know that she had an unwanted visitor who had been following her carefully home. The giant lion stalked up to her front door, knocked it down, and entered her home. Before the woman could register what was going on, the lion pounced on her. It bit and clawed at her, trying to quickly subdue her just like it had done to the boy. Valiantly, the woman tried to fight back. She struggled desperately to get the lion off of her, but it had the size and surprise advantage, and soon her injuries were too significant for her to do anything but lie helplessly as the lion took her life. The lion left once it was done with her, and upon discovering the harrowing scenes, authorities searched the bushes around the house for clues as to where it had gone. They did not find the lion, but they did find the woman's remains. Her head and arms lay haphazardly in the bushes. The lion had eaten everything else. Her remains were later buried, but the lion was far from done hunting. The very next night, a young man and his friends planned to sneak out of their homes and meet up. Like many teenagers, they simply planned on messing around and having fun while the village slept. As one of the young men walked through the darkness on his way to the meeting point, he was jumped by the lion right in front of the game ranger's office. He was immediately knocked to the ground, and the lion proceeded in its usual fashion, biting and clawing him around his head and neck. Overhearing the attack, the game ranger on duty jumped to action and fired his rifle in the air. Startled, the lion bolted and disappeared into the wild grass once again, leaving the young man bleeding on the ground. He was taken to the hospital almost immediately, but he had lost a lot of blood from the severe lacerations the lion had left on his head and neck. The man-eater did not get to feast that night, but the exhausted and injured young man succumbed to his injuries. The community had lost another person to the vicious lion. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. Over the next few weeks, 3 more people died at the paws of the lion. One was a village woman the lion murdered on her porch just outside her door in broad daylight. As usual, the lion lay low in the grass, waiting for a moment when it felt confident enough to strike. As the local group of game rangers approached the woman to warn her about the attacks, the lion ambushed her right before their eyes. She didn't have a moment to react, and the rangers could not respond in time. One of them quickly fired a shot in the air and another at the beast, but the damage had already been done. The lion had inflicted fatal wounds on the woman, and there was nothing the game rangers could do to help. She died before she could make it to the hospital. So far, the man-eater of Mfuwe had claimed the lives of 6 victims, and both the villagers and authorities were at a loss on how to take down this murderous beast. As female lions are the primary hunters of the pride, the authorities took short hunting trips to cut the local lion pride down by a few individuals. In August 1991, they randomly chose a lioness from the pride and shot her dead, but the attacks continued. The man-eater's last victim was a woman named Jesline from the Luangwa Valley village of Ngozo. Jesline had been on the edge ever since she'd heard of the attacks. No one knew where the lion would strike next or if it would strike next, and it was disturbing to think that such a beast could still be on the loose. She had just bagged her laundry to take down to the river the next day for washing, and with that plan in mind, she laid down in bed and went to sleep. While she slept, the man-eater broke through her door and dragged her from her bed with its teeth and claws. Jesline screamed in pain and terror, shouting for help as the lion carted her off into the bush. The lion devoured her body and bolted off, frightening the villagers. With each attack, the lion had become more confident in its skills and cunning. This time, it didn't stop at just eating Jesline. By the afternoon of the next day, the lion was back. The villagers watched in terror as the giant lion swaggered confidently through the village and into Jesline's hut. It remained inside for a few minutes before it strutted right back out, carrying her bag of dirty laundry in its mouth. For some reason, the lion took her dirty laundry with it into the bush, likely because it smelled like its last meal, or maybe it wanted a trophy for its kill. Peering out the windows, her neighbors banged their pots and pans in an effort to scare the lion off, but their actions only seemed to encourage it. The predator calmly carried the bag to the center of the village and set it down. Then it let out a mighty roar, looking around at the huts as if daring someone, anyone, to come out and defy it. Of course, no one would dare, and the lion, satisfied, picked the bag up again and strutted off into the bush. Through the following days, the lion was seen playing with the laundry bag like a house cat with a ball of yarn. It would swat at the bag, pounce on it, chew it, and roll it around. The villagers could hardly believe what they were seeing. It was at this point that they deduced that the beast indeed could not have been an ordinary lion. No, the man-eater of Mfuwe was a demon, and by playing with the bag, it was casting evil spells. Better still, they decided a sorcerer had changed into a lion to terrorize them. The lion's murderous spree was so disruptive and its actions so disturbing that professional hunters visiting the area decided to see what they could do to get rid of the predator. The first hunter to attempt dispatching the lion was a Japanese bounty hunter who specialized as a hired hitman. The bounty hunter set traps all over the area and pursued the lion for weeks, but ultimately ended up unsuccessful. It seemed that the cunning lion was toying with them like it knew when they were watching and when they weren't. Adrian Carr, a local safari hunter, tried his luck next. Along with setting traps like the first hunter, Adrian also set up bait and a blind made of paper bags to try and kill the lion. He hung a carcass about 10 feet off the ground from a tree, then hid behind the blind a short distance away. One night while waiting, Adrian heard the lion's footfalls as it approached the bait. He could hear the beast chewing, and he decided to let it eat for a while before putting a bullet in it. After about 20 minutes, Adrian flipped on the spotlight and could clearly see the giant lion standing on its hind legs as it chewed on the carcass. He aimed his rifle at the lion, but the presence of the light sent the lion running into the nearby cover of darkness. Like the previous bounty hunter, Adrian failed to end the lion's reign of terror. The man-eater of Mfuwe finally met its deserved end when Wayne Hosek stepped into the scene. Wayne was a professional hunter from California, and he'd heard about the beast while visiting the area on a private hunting trip. Coincidentally, his hunting party had come across the lion's toy, Jesline's laundry bag, in a dry riverbed. Wayne and fellow hunter Charles Bukes decided to turn the predator into prey. They set a trap consisting of the laundry bag and a large stash of hippo meat. They set up a hide nearby and lay low and wait for the lion. It wasn't an easy hunt. The men waited patiently for almost 3 weeks in the hide, but it was like the lion knew they were there and wanted to play. It moved as it pleased, often circling the bait without seeming particularly interested. The hunters moved the side of their hide several times in an attempt to get a jump on the lion, but while moving it, the stealthy lion would slip under their noses and steal the bait, so they'd have to set fresh bait out and try again. This game of cat and mouse, or more accurately large cat and hunters, went on for weeks. The lion was so elusive that Hosek almost began to believe that it was a demon too. That was until he realized that the man-eater exploited the times they moved locations to get under their noses. The hunters decided to throw a feint. They pretended like they were moving so that the lion would let its guard down. They built a blind, left the bait, and hid elsewhere, acting like they were going about business as usual. It worked. The lion approached the abandoned bait, moving confidently. When it got to the open blind, it turned around and snarled. The lion had realized a little too late that it had been tricked. He began to rush towards the hunter's real location, but Hosek was ready. He raised his rifle, aimed, and shot. Bang. The bullet left the gun and landed right in the lion's left shoulder, causing it to crumple into an angry mass of fur and claws. The hunters wasted no time in killing the enormous lion. Its reign of terror had gone on far too long, and now it was finally over. The man-eater of Mfuwe was dead. Upon its death, the people swarmed out of the village to spit at the animal's corpse and beat it with sticks. The demon was finally gone, and they were not going to pass up an opportunity to celebrate. Local shamans did rituals over its body to make sure that its supposed supernatural powers were banished once and for all. The powerful shape-shifting sorcerer was dead, and they had to ensure it never cast another spell. The man-eater of Mfuwe was eventually stuffed and displayed at the Field Museum in Chicago, along with its favorite toy, Jesline's laundry sack. The maneless male lion remains there on display to this day. Wayne Hosek, the man who killed the man-eater, would go on to write about it in his 2009 memoir, The Man-Eater of Mfuwe. All in all, although the total body count for the lion is relatively low for such a feared beast, it has become a local legend, a boogeyman for kids' bedtime stories to warn them about the dangers of playing too late and not looking over their shoulders for stalkers. As majestic as lions are, they are still deadly predators, and a lion on the loose usually spells disaster for any of those who cross its path. Its teeth biting you as you cry out in pain before ultimately meeting your final affliction.
In Hammanskraal, 30 miles north of South Africa's Pretoria, lies Mahala View Lion Game Lodge. It offers accommodation in a range of self-catering lodges overlooking the surrounding bush and neighboring Dinokeng Game Reserve. Today, small game like impala and kudu can be seen on site, and the Big Five can be seen in the neighboring reserve. People can escape the hustle and bustle of the big city and find relaxation and calm amidst the relative oasis. The site used to be most famous as the home of the Lion Man, Leon van Biljon. The main attraction was the 3 lions that were kept there. Their names were Rambo, Katrin, and Nikita, and Leon offered lion walking tours in which he would give a detailed lecture about lions before taking visitors down to the enclosure to see the animals. The lions were semi-habituated. They had lived at the reserve nearly all their lives. In 1985, Leon and his family had moved to the lodge. Back then it was just open field, but Leon spent time introducing wildlife to his land. He built lodges to accommodate visitors and offered game drives. His children grew up there, and business was going well. In 2006, he bought 3 lion cubs. He spent all day with them and often all night too, sleeping in their enclosure until daybreak. Although he had 2 daughters of his own, Leon treated the 3 little cubs like his children. He was devoted to them, and they were loyal and tame with him. At least they were for the first 13 years of their lives at the lodge. Leon saw the potential of keeping the lion cubs. Through them, he could educate people and, in his own way, help to conserve these remarkable animals. He was clearly passionate about his lions. He offered guests the chance to see the apex predators up close, with just thin wires separating them. Leon would talk to the guests whilst inside their enclosure, stroking the lion's fur, commanding the lion's respect. He gave lectures about the importance of these fascinating animals and allowed visitors to watch at feeding time. Guests would relax in their lodges at nighttime and listen to the sound of the lions roar, their moaning and groaning echoing across the neighboring reserve. It was a magical experience for the guests. The lodge looked out over the adjacent Dinokeng Game Reserve, where famous lion whisperer Kevin Richardson lived with his lions. Leon wasn't the only man who had a special bond with his lions and who used that special bond to educate and inspire the general public. Leon was in his 70s. He had recently put the site up for sale so that he could retire. He had worked his whole life, and now it was time for him to enjoy his time with his expanding family. He was a grandfather and a great-grandfather now, and his work with the lions and at the lodge had come to an end. On the 20th of August 2019, it did end, but not in the way that Leon had planned. He was still very much known as the Lion Man, even in his 70s, and still offered the daily talks and game drives in the reserve. He wasn't just in charge of the lions' well-being and welfare. He also took care of the site's maintenance. Leon had noticed that there was a patch of fencing along the perimeter of the lion enclosure that needed repairing. He stepped inside the enclosure as he often did and made his presence known to the big cats. As he looked at them, all three of them, he didn't notice anything unusual. Rambo, Katrin, and Nikita just watched their owner opening the security gate and closing it behind him. He had done this 1,000 times before. He calmly walked over to the broken fence and inspected it. Then he made a fatal mistake. Whether complacency got the better of him or whether he had done the following hundreds of times before, we don't know. But he turned his back to the three lions and knelt down on the ground. This was the mistake, and it was to be the last mistake that Leon would make. As if signaling dinner time, seeing Leon in the vulnerable position seemed to trigger a switch in one of the lions. Its eyes stared at its owner. It didn't hesitate. It didn't mock charge. Instead, it ran at Leon and pounced on top of him within seconds. Leon didn't see or hear it coming. It happened at lightning-fast speed. The lion leapt down from one of the enclosure's platforms and launched itself onto Leon's back. Instinctively, it went for his neck. Its huge jaws opened wide before clamping down around his throat with a force of 650 psi. Its 4-inch canine severed muscle and artery in one bite. In the seconds that followed, Leon managed to let out a cry. This was heard by the staff, and they came running. They were shocked at the scene before them. Immediately, they shot the lion that was on top of Leon, and then they shot another that was standing just feet away. But it was too late. Leon lay motionless on the ground. Blood poured from his open neck wound. He didn't make a sound. He was dead. The other staff tried to get to him, but there was a third lion in the enclosure, which they couldn't get a clean shot of. They called the emergency services, but there wasn't anything anybody could do. The third lion was eventually killed in order to allow paramedics into the enclosure and attend to Leon. He couldn't be revived. The bite to his neck had been catastrophic. The attack had been a complete surprise, and it had happened so quickly. Leon had taken his eyes off the cats for a second. He had made the fatal mistake of crouching down with his back turned. Instinct took over, and the lion attacked. It is so easy to be lulled into a false sense of security when working with animals that you have known for many years. Leon had literally raised those lions from cubs. He had held them in his arms and lain with them whilst they slept. They knew him inside and out, and he thought he knew them too. It was a tragic incident that Leon never saw coming. He trusted the big cats with his life every time he entered their enclosure. No matter how habituated an animal might be, it is still a wild animal and should be treated as such. Instinct runs deep. It cannot be wiped out or erased from an animal's DNA. Now, not only had Leon lost his life, but so too had 3 lions. Attacks like this have happened before. It seems lions are the least predictable of the wild cats when held in captivity. 60% of all captive big cat attacks occur from captive lions rather than captive cheetahs, tigers, mountain lions, or jaguars. After the initial shock and devastation that followed his death, Leon's family have now said that they are at peace with what happened. It gave them some comfort that Leon died doing what he loved, working in a place he loved, and with the animals he loved. At the time of Leon's attack in 2019, there had been 40 incidents in South African captive carnivore facilities since 1996. 13 of those had been fatal. Director of Animal Welfare Organization 4 Paws, Fiona Miles, said that they had found that in facilities where human-animal interaction is frequent, the animals had seemed to reach breaking point and had lashed out. Although it is easy to think that animals that are in regular contact with people would be less aggressive towards them, in some cases it seems the opposite is true. It's clear that Leon loves his 3 lions enough to refer to them as his children. They weren't raised for hunting and had spent that majority of their lives outside of a cage. There was never any incidents involving the lions acting aggressively to visitors. Out of nowhere, he was fatally mauled by his 3 children, after which they too sadly met their final affliction. This is the story of a poacher who perhaps got what he deserved. No information has been released regarding the man's name, so for the purposes of this story, we will refer to him as Malusi. On April 1st, 2019, Malusi and his 3 friends set off on a hunt. They were searching for rhinos in the infamous Kruger National Park. At more than 7,500 square miles in size, Kruger is abundant in wildlife. Just under 1 million people visit the park each year. It is home to thousands of animals, including the Big Five. It is a sanctuary for so many species, but sadly, it is not immune from the pressures of poaching. Stretching more than 220 miles north to south and 40 miles west to east, some poachers slip through the net and go undetected. When this happens, the consequences can be devastating. Some years, anti-poaching patrols pick up literally hundreds of poachers. The battles between rangers and poachers can be bloody and lethal, but despite the dangers, poachers keep coming back for more. This was the path that Malusi had taken. The temptation for a large pay packet had lured him into the life of wildlife crime. Rhino horn is in high demand from the Far East. Despite being made of keratin, the same protein found in our hair and nails, people believe that it has medicinal properties and can cure the likes of cancer. As long as there is demand for rhino horn, there will be poaching, and there doesn't seem to be any let-up in that demand anytime soon. Malusi and his 3 accomplices hiked towards the boundary of Kruger National Park. They had set out at nightfall. It was a full moon. The silvery light shone on the border fence, and the 3 men cut away the wire to make a hole just big enough to crawl through. They marked the entry point with a rock and walked into the reserve. It was a still night. The shrill chirping of the crickets in the long grass filled the air. They breathed in the scent of the African wilderness as they stepped through the undergrowth. Their senses were on high alert. They were looking for signs of rhinos. Sometimes they could smell the dung. Sometimes they could hear their low rumbles or the chewing of grass. It wasn't long before Malusi crouched down to the ground. He had come across a large pile of dung. It was definitely that of a rhino, and it was moist, a sign that it was fresh and that the rhino must be nearby. The 3 of them flicked on the flashlight and pointed it at the ground. They could make out the large, round footprints of a rhino leading away from the pile of dung. They followed the trail, not uttering a word. They knew the drill. They always hunted in a group of 3 or 4, one to shoot the rhino, the other to cut off its horn, and the 3rd and 4th to keep watch. They carried with them 2 .375 hunting rifles and ammunition. They knew they were close now. The excitement of the hunt began to grow, and they scanned the bushes for their quarry. The moonlight played tricks on the mind. Shadows loomed tall and distorted their view. The distant groan of a lion traveled on the gentle breeze, and the acacia trees rattled overhead. Then they heard it and stopped dead in their tracks, the snort of a rhino. It must have been just feet from where the men were standing. They strained their eyes. Just beyond the bushes, they could see the characteristic outline of a white rhino. It was a magnificent animal, standing 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing upwards of 4,000 pounds, or 1,800 kilograms. It had its head bowed down low as it grazed the grass. They were so close that they could hear the grass being ripped from the ground and the rhino chewing without a care in the world. With such an impressive size, the rhino had an equally impressive horn. Worth more than their weight in gold, the front horns on females can grow to as much as 150 centimeters, or 59 inches long. Mauled raised his rifle. He cocked his head slightly and stared down the scope. It was an easy shot. Once he squeezed the trigger, the men knew that they would have to be quick. The loud crack of the gunshot would echo across the park, and the anti-poaching patrol would be onto them in a matter of minutes. But Mauled never had the chance to pull the trigger. With their sights set firmly on the rhino, none of the men had noticed a large bull elephant in the bushes just yards away to their right. It had sensed the danger they posed, and with a loud trumpet it thundered towards them. Mauled's friends dived out of the way, but with his eyes focused down the gun's sights, Mauled was last to react. The elephant ran into him, and he was sent flying through the air. He hit the ground with a hard smack. The rhino ran away, and Mauled's 3 friends watched in horror as the huge elephant pressed its enormous foot down on top of him. He cried out in pain as his ribcage was crushed under 2 tons of muscle, bone, and ivory. Mauled heard his bones crack and his ribs pop as the pressure built. Then he fell silent. The elephant shook its head and flapped its ears before disappearing into the bush. Mauled didn't move. His friends rushed to his side. His breathing was labored. His breaths were short and shallow. His lungs crackled. He opened his eyes briefly and then closed them again. His 3 friends lifted him between them and rushed him back through the undergrowth, back the way they had come. But in the panic and urgency of the situation, they had lost their way. Instead, they became more and more lost and disoriented until they eventually stumbled onto one of Kruger's tar roads. They knew rangers and anti-poaching units patrolled these roads, and they had no intention of being caught that night. The sun would be rising soon, and so they lay Mauled down beside the road and ran off to find their way out of the park. The moonlight illuminated Mauled's body. His breathing had slowed. Over the chirping crickets, his wheezy breaths and intermittent moans could be heard as he drifted in and out of consciousness. He was a wounded animal, and there were plenty of predators inside Kruger's gates that were opportunistic hunters. Their eyes glinted in the silvery light. The cackle of a hyena and yip of a jackal sounded nearby. But something else was moving in the undergrowth, something larger. It moved closer to him. Lying on his back, staring up at the stars, Mauled suddenly felt like he was being watched. He moved his head from side to side to try and see into the darkness. Sweat poured from his brow. Pain surged through him like 1,000 knives. He couldn't move. Then, swiftly, something rushed at him from the tall grass. It was upon him in seconds. He felt the warm, powerful body pounce on top of him, and the sharp canines of a lion closed around his throat. The next day, his friends phoned Mauled's family and delivered the devastating news. Distraught and hoping and praying to bring him home, his family called Regional Ranger Don English. He reassured them that he would do everything he could to locate the young man. A search party was set up. Rangers set out on foot, and the Kruger National Park Air Wing flew over the area in an attempt to locate him. As light faded on the first day of the search, it was called off, only to resume the following morning. 3 days after the elephant attack, field rangers found what appeared to be Mauled's remains. They were found at the Crocodile Bridge section of the park and consisted only of a skull and a pair of trousers. The pride of lions had completely devoured Mauled's body. His skull had been licked clean, and no other evidence of him was found. It was a gruesome discovery, and clearly devastating for his family and friends. The guns were found slung in the bushes nearby along with the ammunition. Police arrested the 3 accomplices, aged between 26 and 35. They were held in custody and faced charges of possession of firearms and ammunition without a license, conspiracy to poach, and trespassing. In South Africa alone, hundreds of rhinos are poached each year. An exceptional year was 2014, when 1,215 rhinos were poached. Poachers like Mauled could potentially cause the extinction of some of the world's most beautiful animals. It's reasons like this that when people hear about a pride of lions eating someone alive, it's hard to feel bad about an otherwise horrible final affliction.